the middle of a Tuesday morning, and a man named Keith Whitaker has just filled his ute with petrol at a servo in Melbourne. The ute is a big Ford F-250, the sort of vehicle that reliably works farms and building sites the length of the country. Keith has a doctor's appointment in Canberra, an hour or so south, and an ordinary day ahead of him. He pulls out onto the highway, has a swig from an oak chocolate milk, and begins to watch the country rolling past. Dry paddocks and fence posts, and the long shallow basin of Lake George opening up ahead. The radio's on and he settles in for the drive. Somewhere near Lake George, he feels it. Something incredibly unexpected, a kick against the back of his seat. Can't be, he thinks to himself. But there it is again. He turns, and there on the floor behind him, a young woman. She looks frightened. He pulls over frantically, his heart racing. What on earth is going on here? He tries his best to understand the situation, but she won't talk to him. He jumps out and begins to pace around the car, trying to figure out what to do next. And for 20 minutes or so, she gives him almost nothing. At about this point, she shifts herself into the seat and stares straight ahead. He leans through the window and asks, "Who are you?" She can't tell him, she says. She doesn't know her own name. She doesn't know where she is or how she came to be lying on the floor of his F-250. He asks whether she's hurt, whether she needs water or help, but she just keeps saying no. She's well dressed and oddly calm, and at one point she offers him $50 for his trouble, which he waves away. He decides the best thing to do is call the police. And while the two of them are just waiting there, somewhere on the road between Melbourne and Canberra, she continues to do nothing but stare straight ahead. As Whitaker would later put it, as though she was catatonic. A week ago, this woman was picking red currants on her family's farm on the outskirts of Melbourne. A normal life, a hard-working family, running a successful business. But today she's on the floor of a stranger's ute, lost inside her own mind. And she is only the first of 5 people who will be found, one at a time, scattered across 2 states. This is the story of how an ordinary Australian family climbed into a single car, left behind everything that could connect them to the world, and drove more than 1,500 kilometres into a shared nightmare that none of them, to this day, can fully explain. G'day, welcome back to Strewth, the podcast that goes looking for the strangest stories this country has to offer. I'm your storyteller, Mark. A couple of weeks ago, I put up a poll on the Facebook and Instagram pages about cases that you guys would like to hear. And while the lion's share of the vote went to covering a case about Ivan Milat, there was more than a fair few of you who wanted to hear this particular tale about the Tromp family. And so here it is. It's a strange case. It's not a murder. It's not, in the end, even a disappearance, because every person in it was found alive. There's no villain, no bodies, no unsolved crime. And yet it remains one of the most baffling things to have happened in modern Australia. A mystery that police, psychiatrists, and even the family themselves have never been able to fully account for. And a specific content warning before we begin. This episode deals with mental ill health and acute psychological distress, and later, when we briefly cover a second case, it also deals with violence and death. So if that is difficult for you today, please take care of yourself. The Tromps lived at Sylvan a small town in the Yarra Ranges on the outer eastern edge of Melbourne. Green hills, cool air, market gardens, berry farms, wineries, a beautiful part of the world. Mark Tromp was 51. His wife, Jacoba, was 53. And together they had built a genuinely successful life straight out of the soil. They owned and operated both a red currant farm and an earth-moving business. It's the type of operation that takes decades of early mornings and late nights to build. At the time of this story, they had 3 adult children, all still close to home. Rihanna, 29, Mitchell, 25, and Ella, 22. Friends, neighbours, local police who knew them all said the same thing afterwards. These were normal, hard-working, grounded folk. There was no history of mental illness in the family, certainly no trouble with the law. They were known as a family that turned up, did the work, and kept to themselves. Absolutely nothing to suggest what was about to happen to them all. In August 2016, something had begun to change, and it started with Mark, the father. Exactly when it began and exactly what set it off, nobody can say with any great certainty. But what is clear is that in the lead-up, Mark and Jacoba had both grown increasingly anxious, and then frightened, and then convinced that someone was watching them, that someone was following them, that someone meant to do them harm and to take their money. They didn't, or perhaps couldn't, name or even describe the threat. But for Mark, and increasingly for Jacoba, the danger was as real as the ground under their boots. Their son Mitchell would later describe it not as a single event, but more of an accumulation. In his words, it was a build-up of different, normal, everyday events, just run-of-the-mill pressure getting the better of them, and it slowly got worse as the days went by. And by the last weekend of August, the fear had hardened into a plan. If someone was hunting them, then the answer was to disappear completely, to take the family somewhere they could not be found by anyone, by any means. Their only focus at this point was to protect their family from this unseen and unnamed threat. And so, on the morning of Monday, the 29th of August 2016, the 5 of them got into Ella's silver Peugeot and drove away from the farm. What they left behind tells you exactly how frightened they had become. They didn't take time to pack. They left the house unlocked. And inside, laid about the place, were the things you would never leave without if you intended to be gone for any length of time. 3 mobile phones, 2 passports, credit cards, cash in accounts they wouldn't touch. And out in the sheds, the family's other cars waited with the keys still hanging in their ignitions. Mark and Jacoba made it crystal clear to the children. This was to be a journey with no electronic trail of any kind. No phone was to be rung, no card was to be traced, cash only, off the grid, untrackable. This was not a holiday. They were going to ground. But there was one problem with their plan. Mitchell, the middle child, had quietly brought his phone along for the ride. And so in the car that first day, there were 5 adults, 2 parents, 3 grown children, heading north out of the Yarra Ranges with no clear destination. They were just escaping this unknown threat. Mark at the wheel, certain in his conviction, Jacoba beside him, increasingly sharing that certainty. And in the back, 3 siblings at 3 different distances from belief. Of the children, Mitchell seems to have been the most clear-eyed. He did not share his parents' conviction that the family was in danger. By his own account, he came along not because he believed, but because he could not bring himself to leave them. As he put it later, he just had to go with the family because he wanted to see where they were going, what they were going to do. He could not abandon them. He felt as though it was his job to really keep them safe. About 30 kilometres from home, near the town of Warburton, the phone became a problem. Someone in the backseat realised Mitchell had it. And to a group of minds convinced that it is being tracked, a phone is not a phone, it's a beacon. It is the enemy's eye riding along in the backseat, giving away their position at all times. And so Mitchell was told in no uncertain terms to get rid of it. And so he dutifully wound down the window and threw his phone out onto the roadside and watched it go. And with that phone went the family's last link to the ordinary world. From this point, no one could reach them and no one could find them. They were now, by their own design, completely disconnected. They drove through that day and into the night, through Victoria, across the border into New South Wales, on, until they reached the town of Bathurst, roughly 800 kilometres from home, out to the west of Sydney. They'd been in the car the better part of a day and a night, and it was at Bathurst early the next morning that the family began to break apart. Around 7 o'clock on the Tuesday, in a Bathurst suburb called Kelso, Mitchell had had enough. The clear-eyed one, the reluctant passenger, decided he was going home. He left the others and began the long journey back to Victoria on his own. By train. Well, by a series of them, all the way to Sydney and then south. And so then there were 4. The remaining Tromps, Mark, Jacoba, Rihanna and Ella, turned and drove to one of the region's best known tourist spots, the Jenolan Caves in the Blue Mountains, a strange detour for a family supposedly fleeing for their lives, a beautiful spot full of day trippers. But by now the logic of the journey, if there ever was any, was crumbling at a rapid rate. And it was at Jenolan that the 2 daughters reached their own breaking point. Rihanna, 29, and Ella, 22, decided they had to get away, this time from their parents. They had no car of their own, of course, so they took one that was not theirs and drove south to the town of Goulburn, where they did the thing that finally pulled the outside world into this story. They reported their own parents as missing. At a Goulburn petrol station, the 2 sisters split up. Ella said she wanted to go home to feed her horses. And so she got back into the car they had taken and drove the rest of the way to Victoria, arriving at the family farm at Sylvan on the Tuesday night, where she found the police already waiting. Rihanna did not go with her, and what Rihanna did next is the image this case is remembered by. Somewhere in Goulburn, as we mentioned in the opener, she climbed unseen into a stranger's ute, a big Ford F-250, and lay down on the floor of the cab, behind the driver's seat. After Whittaker had felt that kick against his seat and found her on the floor. After the police arrived to find Whittaker pacing around his car, trying to figure out what on earth to do with his stowaway, an ambulance took her to Goulburn Hospital, where she was admitted into psychiatric care. So by the Tuesday night, 3 of the 5 had come in from the cold, in very different ways. Mitchell on the trains, heading home of his own accord. Ella behind the wheel of a stolen car, coming home to feed her horses, and Rihanna hospitalised, lost inside her own head. Which left, of course, just 2. And somewhere out on the roads between New South Wales and Victoria, Mark and Jacoba Tromp were still going, still together, still certain that the danger was real and behind them. The only way they could escape it was to remain quiet, off the grid. Except now, the entire country was watching. Because by this point the story was everywhere. A whole family on what can only be described as a bizarre journey. The Australian media and public were, of course, used to people going missing. But in the outback, in the remote, dangerous country where people are swallowed by the wilderness, not on major arterials between cities, and not of their own volition. Back at the farm, Mitchell and Ella, the two Tromps who had come back on their own accord, faced the media. They were visibly shaken, trying to make sense of something they had watched happen from the inside. Mitchell spoke about his father with obvious love and concern. He said he had never seen anyone conduct themselves in this way, that his dad was not dangerous, that his dad was his mate, and that he just wanted him and his mum found. Because Mark and Jacoba were still out there, and they were in very real danger, just not in the way that they had imagined. On the Wednesday, the parents drove south, back towards Melbourne, and reached the Victorian town of Wangaratta. And there, the last two members of the family separated from each other. Jacoba left. By means that have never been made entirely clear, she made her way north again, away from home, toward the town of Yass. On the Thursday, a local found her wandering the streets of Yass in an agitated state, and she was taken into the district hospital. She would later be moved to be near her daughter Rihanna, the two of them receiving mental health treatment together, which left Mark alone in Wangaratta. And Mark's last days on the road were the most erratic of all. He was seen leaving the Peugeot parked in a side street, the key still in the ignition, and walking away on foot. He was reported tailgating a young couple dangerously on the road. Police in the area were also looking into a couple of break-ins around the same time, one at a historic cottage and another at a general store nearby. Investigators were careful in what they were saying though, in particular to the media. They found no evidence linking Mark to those break-ins, and, as one detective put it, if nothing was stolen and nothing was damaged, then likely nothing untoward had actually happened. For 2 more days, Mark was a man alone, sometimes on foot, sometimes by car, somewhere in Victoria's northeast, while the search swung into action around him. It all ended on the Saturday evening, 3rd of September, 6 days after the family had first driven away from Sylvan. A passerby spotted a man walking along Greta Road on the outskirts of Wangaratta, out near the airport. Police came. The man was Mark Tromp. He was questioned and he was assessed by a mental health officer, and then found to have committed no crime that warranted holding him. He was released into the care of his brother, who happened to be a fellow police officer. And as he was driven away from the cameras, Mark Tromp raised his middle finger to the assembled photographers. It was not the gesture of a man at peace, but in the days that followed, something in him seemed to settle. He released a statement altogether different in tone, apologising for the hurt and concern the whole affair had caused, and paying his respects to the community and resources that had gone into helping his family. The two sisters were later charged over the car that they'd taken, but Rihanna's charge was dismissed on mental health grounds, and in the end, police treated the entire episode for what it was. There was no crime to be prosecuted, but, in their words, it was a family affair. 6 days, 5 people, more than 1,500 kilometres in total. And thankfully, mercifully, at the end of it, every single one of them alive and home. But the question the whole country was still asking, perhaps now louder than ever, was a very simple one. Why? The investigators who handled the case were as puzzled as anyone. One officer from the Sylvan district, a man with 3 decades on the job, called it the most bizarre case he'd seen in those 30 years. Sergeant Mark Knight, who knew the family personally, summed it up bluntly. He was sure, he said, that this was just a massive meltdown. But a meltdown caused by what? Over the months that followed, a handful of explanations were put forward. The first was environmental. The Tromps were berry farmers, and berry farming, like most agriculture, does involve chemicals. Sprays, pesticides, the working substances of a red currant operation. So the question was asked, could long-term exposure to something on the farm have triggered a chemically driven psychosis, a paranoia with a physical cause? It's not a mad idea. Some toxins do affect the brain. But this theory does not survive contact with the evidence. The family underwent blood tests and other physical checks, and nothing turned up to support the theory. More tellingly, whatever gripped Mark and Jacoba most severely did not grip all 5 family members equally, which is hard to square with a shared poison they all lived and worked around. And so investigators pretty quickly set this potential solution to one side. The second theory was pressure. Plain, ordinary, very modern pressure. A family running 2 businesses, farm and earth-moving company, with all of the financial weight that carries. And some speculated about debt, about money troubles, about a household quietly buckling under the strain. This is closer to something true, and the family themselves have pointed to pressure as a factor. But the very specific version, that they were fleeing creditors or hiding from a financial threat, did not hold up either. Police were clear on this point. The family, based on their investigations, had no significant debts. There were no creditors at the door. And so whatever was crushing them, it was not a bill they couldn't pay. The third answer was the most straightforward, and the one the family themselves believed at the time. That they were running from a genuine threat, that someone really was after them. The trouble with this particular theory, though, is that no such someone was ever found. No stalker, no enemy, no person with motive and means. Police investigated and were satisfied that there'd been no real threat to the family at any point. And as I mentioned before, there was no debt, and therefore no crazy loan shark to avoid. And there was also no trace whatsoever of something more nefarious, like a gambling or a drug debt that needed to be settled. The danger that sent 5 people fleeing across 2 states left no trace in the outside world, for the simple reason that, as far as anyone has been able to establish, that danger was never there to begin with. And this brings us to the fourth explanation. It is the one investigators and psychiatrists kept returning to, and the one that fits the facts of the case better than any of the others. It also happens to be, in a number of ways, a great deal stranger than any flesh and bone stalker would have been. It has a name. Folie à deux. Folie à deux is a French term. It translates more or less as the madness of 2. It is a real and recognised psychiatric phenomenon, known in clinical terms today as shared psychotic disorder or shared delusional disorder. The idea behind it is this. One person develops some type of delusion, a fixed false belief that doesn't yield to evidence. And then, through sheer closeness, that delusion transmits itself onto someone else. A second person who would never have arrived at the belief alone catches it the way you might catch a mood, and comes to hold on to this delusion just as firmly as the first. The term was coined in the 19th century in France to describe exactly such a couple. Two people who were locked into a shared delusion, reinforcing each other's false beliefs in a closed loop, until doctors could no longer even tell which of the two had become unwell first. There are two things that make this possible: isolation and intimacy. Folie à deux occurs almost exclusively among people who are extremely close and somewhat cut off from the wider world. So quite often it's couples, siblings, families. A tight family unit turned inward with one strong personality whose conviction the others find difficult to resist is close to a perfect breeding ground. One mind tips. And because the others are so close, so trusting, so enclosed, they tip as well. And so you can see why investigators reached for this explanation. A father becomes convinced the family is in danger. His wife, closest to him, comes to share the belief. Their daughters, in the pressure cooker of the car and the journey, begin to be pulled in too. Rihanna said as much herself. Later, she admitted she had started to believe her father's claims that the family was in danger. In her own words, you do start thinking the same. You have a few things and they build up and you can get sick in some way. It was only Mitchell, slightly more on the outside, that kept enough distance to doubt. And therefore it is no coincidence that Mitchell is the one who got out first. There is some caution with this though. No one has ever formally diagnosed the Tromp family with folie à deux. There was no clinical finding, no official label. The experts who suggested it were offering a framework, not in any way, shape or form a verdict. And I'm doing the same. This is just a theory, but it's a theory that fits. And to understand just how far a shared delusion can carry ordinary people, I think it might help to look at a case where it was documented in horrifying detail. But for that, we're going to have to leave Australia and head to a motorway in England. And just a reminder, this next part involves violence and a death. In May of 2008, two Swedish twin sisters, Ursula and Sabina Eriksson, were travelling together in England. And by the accounts of those who encountered them that day, the pair were behaving strangely, anxious, agitated, frightened of things no one else could see. And they ended up on the M6, one of the busiest motorways in the country, walking along it on foot. And then, on camera, captured by a television crew that happened, by extraordinary coincidence, to be filming a reality TV show with the Highway Patrol at the time, both women did something that has unnerved everyone who has watched the footage since. Without warning, without reason, they ran, without deviating, straight into that traffic, straight into oncoming trucks and cars. Both of the sisters were struck by vehicles, both were seriously injured, and both, astonishingly, kept fighting, struggling against the police and paramedics who were trying to save them, apparently still gripped by the conviction that the people helping them meant them harm. One of the sisters even managed to lunge back into the oncoming traffic on a second occasion. The two were eventually separated and taken to hospital. Ursula, gravely hurt, was in time released to her family. But for Sabina, this tragedy was not over. After being discharged, Sabina, alone now and still unwell, was taken in by a kind English stranger, a man who offered her a place to rest. The following day, in circumstances that remain Deeply disturbing. That man was fatally stabbed, and Sabina was responsible. She was arrested and later convicted in connection with his death. The court accepted that she had not been in her right mind, and she served a custodial sentence and was eventually returned to Sweden. What makes the Eriksson case so chilling and so relevant here is that these were two people, twins, as close as human beings can be, who appeared to have shared a single break from reality and acted on it together, but this time with consequences that turned deadly. The same enclosed intimacy, the same conviction that the world outside was the threat, the same inability of bystanders to reach them with simple facts. The Tromps potentially, and again this is a theory, not a fact, shared a folie à deux that, for all its terror, mercifully harmed no one. The Erikssons show how dark the very same condition can become. And so we're left in the end without a tidy answer. No diagnosis, as I mentioned, was ever confirmed. No threat was ever found. The most likely explanation is a shared delusion that arose, took hold, ran its course over 6 days and 1,500 kilometres, and then, just as mysteriously, receded, leaving 5 people able to come back to themselves and to each other. Mortified, but alive. Rihanna later put it more simply than any doctor could. The family, she said, were all very embarrassed. They had never wanted to be famous, especially not for an event like this. And maybe that is where the case stops being a curiosity and starts to feel maybe a bit close to home. If we strip away the strangeness, the stolen car, the ute, the motorway in England, and look at what is left at the centre of it, it is a family under sustained pressure. A pressure with no single source and no obvious release. Just a slow build, the one that Michael described, of normal, everyday events stacking up, day after day, until something gives. This is obviously an extreme example. They were unwell, that much is clear. But the impulse underneath that illness, the need to escape an unbearable, sourceless pressure, to disappear, to put the phone down and drive until no one can reach you. Well, I think that's something that a great many of us on a hard enough day might quietly recognise. The Tromps drove right off the edge of that impulse. And the rest of us mostly just think about it. And perhaps that is the real reason this strange, sad, oddly gentle mystery stayed with the country the way it did. Not because it was so foreign and so bizarre, but because in some small and perhaps uncomfortable way, it was very familiar. But thankfully everyone in this story came home. The farm at Sylvan is still there, and somewhere in the hills east of Melbourne, a family that briefly came apart in front of the whole nation went quietly back to work. Strewth. Thanks again for listening to Strewth. If anything in this episode did strike a bit close for you and you'd like to talk to someone, please reach out, Lifeline 131144. These are just yarns, but they are also sometimes quite difficult to deal with. I appreciate that, so make sure you look after yourself. Thanks as always for listening. I really appreciate it. And if you want to be involved in the next vote we have for an episode, make sure you jump on the Facebook and Instagram groups. There'll be links in the notes below. Hooroo.